Welcome to lesson 15. We're going to be talking about spiritual diversity. This is lesson 15 of our cultural competency course. Today we're going to explore how religion and spirituality are intersecting with counseling and our clients' well-being. And in America, we're going to encounter incredible diversity, from deeply religious people to those who's they're identifying as spiritual but not religious. So as counselors, understanding this spectrum allows us to better connect with our clients' values, their coping mechanisms, and their sense of purpose. And spirituality often influences how people interpret suffering, change, and healing, and it makes it essential in culturally competent counseling. So the United States was a nation that was founded on religious tolerance and diversity and freedom, and that was in opposition to the historical religious oppression in England. And a lot of the founders in the U.S., they wanted freedom of religion, and for them that meant like the right to participate in any religion, including no religion at all. So the separation of church and state was originally intended to avoid that imposition of just one set of beliefs over others. And that was the case in England. So it's important to remember that, religious diversity in the United States at that time essentially meant diverse forms of Protestants. And so some of those early settlers, when they got here, the spirituality of the Native Americans was already clearly in place. And then, over the last 250 years, there's been this just steady influx of immigrant populations that have brought with them this diverse spiritual and religious background, these rituals and traditions. So as a country, the United States has really maintained its emphasis on Protestantism, and that's kind of the cultural norm. So as a result of that, the tensions have developed without this like template where we can incorporate an expanded sense of religious and cultural diversity. But that spirituality and religion are important cultural aspects within the United States. That's really clear. Some of the researchers found that 96% of Americans believe in a higher power, and over 90% pray, and 69% of them are members of a religious community, and 43% of them have attended a service at their church or synagogue or temple or mosque within the last 7 days. And the largest religious group that makes up about 76% of the population self-identifies as Christian. And then the second largest group identifies as non-religious or secular, and that comprises about 13.2% of the population. And then after those two groups, only Judaism includes more than 1% of the population, and some other religions in the United States account for less than 1% of the population, like Islam, Buddhism, agnosticism, atheism, Hinduism. So as evidence of a growing religious diversity in the United States, it's bearing mentioning that several religious groups have seen dramatic increases in recent history. Like from 1990 to 2000, New Age spirituality increased by 240%. Hinduism increased by 237%. Baha'i was 200%. Buddhism by 170%. Native American religions by 119%. Islam by 109%. So beyond these numbers is just the fact that there is a tremendous within-group variance among religious traditions. So knowing that somebody's Jewish or Hindu or Protestant or Buddhist only affords us like this cursory information about the religious and spiritual beliefs, what their practices and experience and rituals and traditions are of that specific person. So let's start by defining our key terms here. Religion typically refers to an organized system of beliefs, rituals, and practices that are shared by a group or community. Spirituality, in contrast, is a little bit more personal. It's an individual's search for meaning and connection and transcendence. And while religion can offer structure and community, spirituality is emphasizing like personal growth and a relationship with something greater than themselves, a higher power, nature, humanity, maybe it's a universal energy. And spirituality really involves beliefs and experiences that help a person transcend the self and connect to a greater purpose or a sense of otherness. It's not limited to one faith or a tradition. It's about transformation. So when somebody describes being at peace, or maybe they're describing being in tune with life, that's a spiritual experience. So as counselors, our goal isn't to define a client's spirituality, but to understand how it's influencing the client's worldview and their recovery. So we can look at religion as the external expression of spirituality. It's a shared system of doctrines and rituals and moral codes. And people may find comfort or community and guidance through religion, and others might feel restricted by it. So, as counselors, we have to remain neutral and respectful. We want to avoid judgment about that client's level of religious involvement. And religion and spirituality often go hand in hand, but not always. Carl Jung suggested that humans have this innate drive toward wholeness, and that's going to include both psychological and spiritual dimensions. And some people may identify as spiritual but not religious, so they're going to seek personal meaning outside organized institutions. So, as counselors, it's important for us to recognize where each client stands on this continuum and tailor our approach accordingly. So I want you to take a moment to reflect. What types of spiritual or religious worldviews might be most difficult for you to work with, and why? How is your background influencing that discomfort? Being aware of our own biases is the first step to providing respectful and culturally sensitive care. So if you were to counsel someone with a belief system very different from your own, what kinds of self-awareness and skills would you need to develop? And to provide y'all with a little bit of context, let's briefly review several major world religions. Each is going to contain unique beliefs and practices, but they're going to share some core values like compassion, integrity, and connection. And understanding these frameworks is going to help us better empathize with our clients whose worldviews are rooted in religious traditions. So in Eastern traditions like Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, spirituality is going to emphasize balance and self-discipline and interconnectedness. And these religions tend to focus on inner transformation and harmony rather than external salvation. So we're going to take a closer look at each one of these. So Buddhism So the most prominent teachings within Buddhism include the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The Four Noble Truths come from the first talk that the Buddha gave after his enlightenment. So the first one is dukkha. All existence is unsatisfactory and it's filled with suffering. And because this is the first noble truth of Buddhism, some falsely think that the Buddha is a negative religion, but that's not the case. Buddhism is more than other religions. It's acknowledging the struggles and the challenges of life and the path to transcend this suffering. The next one is samudaya. This is the root of suffering, that's defined as like a craving or clinging to the wrongdoings. And such a clinging is commonly referred to as an attachment. And then we have dhyarana. This is the possible end to suffering by abandoning our expectations of how things should be. And through this mindfulness, we become more aware of how things really are. And magga is the freedom from suffering, and that's possible by following the Eightfold Path. So, the Eightfold Path is the key to practicing non attachment and ending our suffering. And we know pain is inevitable, but suffering happens when we resist the pain. So, the Eightfold Path includes three major categories: Panna, Sila, and Samadhi. The Panna is the rights of discernment and wisdom. So, this has the first two paths. The first path is the right view, which happens when we embrace the joy of life the way that it is, and without the maya or the illusion or hopes or fears. The second one is the right intention, and that happens when we act with pure intention, free of manipulation, that's born of our expectations, hopes, and fears. Then we have the sila, which is the paths of virtue and morality. So the third path is right speech, and that happens when we speak from right intention in an honest, simple, and genuine way. And then we have right discipline, which happens when we simplify life by surrendering all that complicates our life and our relationships. And then the fifth one is right livelihood, which happens when we form simple relationships with our job and we perform it well with attention to detail. And then we have the samadhi, which is the right concentration. So the sixth path is the right effort. And that happens when we surrender our tendency to struggle and see things as they are and how they're existing. And we work with them without aggression. And then the seventh one is right mindfulness. And that happens when we are precisely and clearly aware of all of our experiences without judgment. And then the last one, the eighth path, is right concentration. And that happens when we are fully aware and completely absorbed in the present moment experience. We're pretty much free of worries for the future and any regrets from the past. Christianity is overwhelmingly the largest religion in the U.S. There's estimates of over 224 million people who practice Christianity, and that's about 76% of the U.S. population. So it should be noted. So Christianity only saw a modest increase of about 5% between 1990 and 2000, and all the other religions are growing much faster. But worldwide, the estimates are about 1 out of every 3 people consider themselves Christian. So worldwide, that number comes to like 1.5 billion people. And so, as with a lot of world religions, there's 2,000 years of history that's kind of resulted in this diverse religion. And within that diversity, there are 3 major divisions of Christianity: Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestants. And then even further, we have denominations of Protestants. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have Southern Baptists, the Methodists, and then like non-denominational churches. And so the common ground for all of these groups is the historical Jesus. This is the man who was born in a stable. He was executed as a criminal at age 33. He never traveled more than 90 miles from his birthplace. He owned nothing, attended no college, he marshaled no army, and instead of producing books, he did his only writings in the sand. And despite those humble roots, we still celebrate December 25th and then the first full moon after the vernal equinox in the northern hemisphere as the holiest days of the year, as Christmas and Easter, to celebrate the birth and death of Christ. And so a central tenet of Christianity is the Trinity. And this is the representation of God the Father, or the parent, Jesus the Son, and the presence of the Holy Spirit. So this is a triune God. It's 3 representations of the same God. Kind of like somebody who wears many hats. I'm work Desiree, I'm mom Desiree, I'm wife Desiree. I have many different roles. And that's kind of how they explain the Trinity. And so for a lot of Christians, Jesus was sent to earth by God to fulfill messianic prophecy that was foretold in what is now called the Old Testament, and that the life and death of Jesus created eternal life. And so it's indicated in the Christian Bible. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God sent the Son into the world not to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him." So within each of the major divisions of Christianity, like Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestants, there remains great variation in the beliefs of how they adhere to it. And the most vocal divides come up between like the conservatives or the fundamentalists and the more moderate liberal factions. So the religion of Islam currently has over 1.5 million adherents, and they're known as Muslims. And in the US, this is the 3rd largest religion in the country, behind only Christianity and Judaism. But the fact that Islam grew by approximately 110% in the United States from 1990 to 2000, that should be an indicator that it is a big religion. Islam is by far the most quickly growing of the Western religions in the U.S. And so worldwide, we know that there are approximately 1.2 billion Muslims, making it the 2nd largest religion in the world. So the central figure to Muslims is Muhammad Abdallah, and he was born in 570 AD in Mecca. And then in 610, Muhammad had his first vision, and he proclaimed Allah to be the one true God, and he condemned idol worship. And then Muslims later forced the city of Mecca to submit and accept Muhammad as a prophet. And Muhammad destroyed all of the idols in the Kaaba or the temple in Mecca. And from Mecca, Muslims waged jihad, or a holy war, and forced the surrounding cities to accept Islam and Muhammad as a prophet. And then Muhammad died in 632. So as with other religions, it's inaccurate to consider Islam as like a monolithic group. And so there's this primary historical division between like the mainstream Sunnis, or the word Sunni is drawn from Sunnah, meaning tradition, and then the Shiites, which is literally partisans of Ali. And the Shiites believed that Ali, which was Muhammad's son-in-law, should have succeeded Muhammad. And Ali was appointed the leader of the Muslims only after being passed over 3 times, and then he was assassinated soon after assuming leadership. So the Shiites comprise about 13% of all Muslims, and they're primarily located in Iraq and Iran. The Sunnis, comprising about 87% of all Muslims, flank the Shiites to both the west and the east. And, we see this divide between the Sunni and the Shiite Muslims. After 9/11, we saw an even wider divide. Then there's a third subgroup of Muslims who are primarily interested in the mystical aspects of Islam. And these are the Sufis. They're more focused on inner life than the outer. And so they kind of emphasize concepts like meaning or inner reality or contemplation. And so Westerners are more familiar with the contemplative dancers among the Sufis. They're called the dervishes. And the love poetry from the Persian Sufi Jalal ad-Din Rumi. So the most central precepts of Islam are known as the 5 pillars. And the first pillar is Islam's creed. It's the Shahada. And there's no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. And then the second pillar of Islam is a prayer. And adherents are encouraged in the Quran to be consistent in prayer. So to this day, Muslims are required to pray 5 times a day facing toward Mecca. And that's a practice that reportedly was negotiated by Muhammad in his renowned night journey to heaven. And then the third pillar of Islam is charity, with a simple message. Those who have much should help lift the burden of those who have less. And the fourth pillar of Islam is the observance of Ramadan. This is Islam's holy month. It's considered holy because it was the month in which Muhammad both received his first revelation and then 10 years later made a famous migration from Mecca to Medina. And so the tradition dictates that able-bodied Muslims fast during Ramadan, neither eating nor drinking from dawn until dusk, and only moderately after sunset. And then Islam's 5th pillar is pilgrimage, dictating that each Muslim who is physically and economically able should make a pilgrimage to Mecca to heighten their devotion to God. Then we have Judaism. There's almost 4 million adherents in the U.S. That's about 1.3% of the population. And that makes Judaism the second largest religion in the United States. And of the approximately 13 million Jews worldwide, approximately 4.7 million of those live in Israel. And those numbers are greatly impacted by one of the greatest atrocities in history, which was the Holocaust. And that was where about 6 million Jews were murdered. And Judaism is a religion, but it's much more than that. It's a culture, and some consider it an ethnicity as well. So they consider themselves culturally and ethnically Jewish, but they don't consider themselves to be Jewish in a religious sense. And as with other religions, there's a variety of Jewish sects that hold distinct beliefs and practices. And of the Jews affiliated with the synagogue, 45% of them consider themselves Reformed Jews. 42% consider themselves conservative Jews, and 9% consider themselves Orthodox, and 4% consider themselves Reconstructivists. And although it oversimplifies the differences somewhat, Orthodox Jews live by the letter of the Torah, which is the 5 books that comprise the central Jewish holy text. And while Reform and conservative and Reconstructivist Jews, they live by the spirit of the Torah, with some variations between them. And so the roots of Judaism began when God spoke to Abraham and promised a nation. And that was followed sometime later by a covenant between God and Moses on Mount Sinai, in which the 10 Commandments were given to Moses and land was promised. And Moses was commissioned to lead the Hebrews out of slavery. So central to that Jewish traditions are the rites of passage and the celebration of religious holy days. Important events in the life cycle include circumcision, and then giving the child a Hebrew name, the bar or the bat mitzvah, marriages, and funerals. And the most important Jewish holy days are often referred to as the high holy days, celebrated during the first 10 days of the month of Tishri. That's usually in September or October. So the first day is Rosh Hashanah, and that's the Jewish New Year. And so for 10 days from Rosh Hashanah until Yom Kippur, Jews think about how they've lived during the past year. They're asked to remember the wrongs that they have and to ask forgiveness from God and from those whom they have hurt. So across religions, common threads emerge. There's a belief in spirits, path towards liberation, and acts of compassion. And whether it's through sacred texts or meditation or prayer, people are seeking connection and peace. And these shared elements remind us that spiritual diversity still unites humanity in the search for meaning. Tenet number 1 is spirit by whatever name exists. Whether it's called God, Goddess, the Divine, the Absolute, Supreme Reality, Brahman, Tao, Allah, Shiva, it doesn't matter. All of these names evolve from various wisdom traditions. Spirit exists. And so there's this certain ineffable quality to spirit that makes the discourse around the spirituality and counseling quite challenging. So the proverbial hand pointing to the moon is not the moon. And the best that we can ever hope to do is, given the numinous and ineffable quality of spirit, is point towards its existence. Thousands of years of spiritual wisdom and experience across many cultural divides lead to the same conclusion. Spirit exists. Tenet number 2 is spirit is found in here, within an open mind and heart. And so although some individual religious groups have worked to create a disconnection between spirit and humankind, claiming that intercessories are required or emphasizing the unworthiness of humans to be connected to spirit, the wisdom of the ages suggests quite clearly and across different traditions that spirit, or at least some collective aspect of that spirit, is going to reside in each of us. Tenet number 3 is many or most don't realize the spirit within. There's a lot of many variations on this theme, but for some, they've kind of disavowed that they're spiritual beings, and such people may either be inexperienced decliners or rejectors. Not acknowledging spirit at all, they can hardly realize spirit within. And others see spirit, using whatever name they've chosen, as being some external entity, a being that, looks down on them from some ethereal realm. So these people see themselves and label themselves based solely on their mortal ego that kind of hopes at some point in the future, I'm going to be one with spirit. And this spirit, this kind of spirituality, it's kind of called a there and then spirituality. It precludes the full experience of the here and now spirituality. And then there is, tenet number 4 is there is a path to liberation, and this involves transcendence of the individual self or the personal ego. And although that path to liberation is unique for every person, there are common aspects of this path. So one is the study of sacred texts, either within your personal faith tradition or across those faith traditions. The second one is discussion of sacred texts in some form of community. Third is a mindfulness-based practice, maybe some sort of vipassana meditation, or a centering prayer, or a breath prayer, or lectio divina. A lot of practitioners of mindfulness practices, particularly those just beginning a practice, find that a teacher or a supportive community of practitioners deepens the practice. And so you can find some recommended readings on these practices. So you can find some great books on meditation from Lashan in 1974 and Gunaratana in 2002. On centering prayer, Keating has a book in 2002. Lewis in 1998 did a breathing prayer book, and Merton in 1986 did a Lectio Divina book. And although, these practices are discussed in the text from like a perspective that's like either non-religious or affiliated with a particular religion, any of these practices can easily be adopted to be consistent with like different belief systems. The fourth one is heartfulness-based practices, like the Buddhist practice of like loving kindness, meditation, and the conscious practice of forgiveness. The fifth one is body-centered practices like focusing, yoga, breath work, tai chi, things like that. And then the sixth one is acting on increased mindfulness with acts of social justice and compassion. Tenet number 5 is, if this path is followed, the result is rebirth or enlightenment. And so through disciplined spiritual practice and study, it is possible to experience kind of a death of the old self and an emergence of, or a rebirth of the new self, more fully authentic and self-actualized. And this transcendence may include like peak experiences, but overall, the process of rebirth or enlightenment is just this gradual and lifelong process. Tenet number 6 is rebirth or enlightenment result in the end of suffering. And so this concept is perhaps best discussed within the Buddhist tradition, where it's commonly acknowledged that pain is inevitable, but suffering is not. So suffering occurs when we resist the physical, emotional, and psychological pain in life. And one of the fruits of the life of disciplined spiritual practice and study is not the eradication of pain, but it's kind of the end of the resistance to the pain. And so we end the suffering. And then tenet number 7, the end of suffering manifests in social actions of mercy and compassion. So ultimately, rebirth or enlightenment, that's going to result in the end of suffering. And it's useful only if it manifests in acts of social justice or mercy or love or compassion for other people. And so in 2003, Smith put it very succinctly when he asserted that altered states are useful only if they lead to altered traits. So, having discussed these diverse belief systems and a framework that provides convergence on the world's wisdom traditions, now we kind of direct our attention towards special considerations in counseling with spiritual issues in counseling. And among these are issues related to approaching spiritual issues and ethical competence and working with a spiritual bypass. So when addressing spirituality in counseling, we may encounter different client attitudes. So impositional is pushing beliefs on others. Rejectionist is denying spirituality altogether. Exclusivist is believing only one truth exists. Constructivist or pluralistic is recognizing that there's multiple valid paths. And our role is to meet clients where they are, not to impose or our own beliefs or avoid spiritual topics altogether. So Kenneth Pargament and Brian Zinbauer, they developed several important category schemes related to the psychology of religion and spirituality, particularly concerning coping styles and the distinction between religiosity and spirituality. So their work has been really influential in helping researchers and clinicians understand the nuanced ways people engage with faith during times of stress. So religious problem-solving styles is what they came up with, and they called it RPSS, and they identified 3 distinct styles people use when dealing with problems through a religious framework. So we have self-directing. This is where the person believes that they're responsible for solving their own problems, so they rely on their own resources and abilities, and God's role is not central to the coping process. So an example would be like, when thinking about a difficulty, I try to come up with possible solutions without God's help. And then the second one is deferring. So the individual is taking a passive approach. They're deferring all responsibility for solving problems to God. And they trust that God is going to take control and resolve the issue. So an example statement might be, I don't think about different solutions to my problems because God provides them for me. And then you have the collaborative style or the collaborative scheme. And this is a person that is working together with God as an active partner in the coping process. And so the person's taking personal responsibility while also seeking God's guidance and support. So an example statement here might be like, the Lord works with me to help me see the number of different ways that a problem can be solved. So Pargament and his colleagues also developed RCOPE, which is a more comprehensive, multidimensional assessment of how people are using religious coping strategies to deal with stress. And so the RCOPE categorizes coping mechanisms into two broad groups. You have the positive religious coping and the negative religious coping. So in positive religious coping, these strategies reflect a secure relationship with the sacred, and they're generally associated with like better mental health outcomes. So examples might include benevolent religious reappraisals, like seeing a stressful event as part of God's plan, or seeking support from clergy or fellow congregants. Maybe they find comfort in some sort of like spiritual connection with a higher power. But then the negative religious coping, this is kind of like an approach that reflects spiritual tension and struggle. And they're generally associated with like poorer health outcomes. So this might be like attributing negative events to being punished or abandoned by God, feeling anger or doubt toward God, maybe some passive resilience on God without taking any personal action. And ethical compliance is the heart of integrating spirituality and religion into the counseling process. In 2005, Favor and Ingersoll provided this really nice framework for considering ethical competence in integrating spirituality and religion into counseling. And they were considering Wilber's concepts in 1997 and 1999 of like translation and transformation. So translation is like those aspects of the spiritual experience, like beliefs, creeds, dogmas, and things like that, that the individual is using as a framework to find meaning and purpose in life. So ethical competence related to the translational aspects of the spiritual life is going to follow those that nomenclature from Zinbauer and Pargament. So, the counselor's working within either a constructivist or a pluralist approach with the client's spiritual and religious beliefs and values. But a little more complex is the ethical competence related to the transformation. So Wilber in 1997 said that the transformational aspect of spirituality involves progressions to higher levels of spiritual development. And that's usually accompanied by like physical, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual breakthroughs. So an example of a transformational experience is like a near-death experience or an NDE. And people who have an NDE commonly become more altruistic, less materialistic, and more loving. So these are attributes that are consistent with like spiritual transformation. More subtle experiences of transformation might happen. Maybe, for example, like a person who has developed and sustained a disciplined contemplative practice, like meditation or centering prayer. And if, in the case of either a spontaneous transformation, like an NDE, or a more gradual one, the central question is whether the counselor can accept and value the spiritual experiences of that person. And at the very least, a counselor who defines themselves religiously from only a translative dimension might have some difficulty working effectively with somebody whose current practice and experiences are more transformational in nature. And the opposite of this is also likely true. A counselor with a bias towards the transformational function of spirituality may run the risk of imposing that on a client whose primary interest is working at the translative, like their beliefs and meaning-making level. And spiritual bypass was a term coined by Whitfield in 2003 to refer to a phenomenon where a person attempts to heal psychological wounds by working at the spiritual level only. And so in doing the work in the other realms, including like the cognitive, emotional, physical, and interpersonal, that's regulated to a less than status, and it's kind of shunned. So in short, the spiritual life of the person serves as an avoidance function because the individual is avoiding other aspects. So spiritual bypass is considered a common problem among people pursuing a spiritual path. And there's a number of common problems that will emerge from spiritual bypass, like compulsive goodness or repression or undesirable emotions, maybe spiritual narcissism, extreme external locus of control, spiritual addiction, blind faith in like charismatic leaders, abdication of personal responsibility, and then we have like social isolation. So from a diversity perspective, the client in spiritual bypass presents a unique challenge, because this client often presents in counseling with an explicit interest, if not a desire, to integrate the sacred into the counseling process. So to fully support the wholeness and healing of these clients, it's likely a necessary thing to encourage and challenge them to work at multiple levels, like cognitive, emotional, physical, interpersonal, but also be respectful. That's no small accomplishment. So let's look at this case study. Gail is a 44-year-old white female. She's presenting in counseling with depression that she reported battling, quote, on and off all my life. And she's been to 3 counselors previously in the past 7 years and have seen 2 counselors within the past 2 years. And she said, they didn't really help me much. She specifically said she was drawn to work with me because of my interest in spirituality. So Gail reported that she was a devout Christian who discovered in the past few years that references to reincarnation existed within the early versions of the Christian Bible, but they were deleted by the Council of Nicaea. And so she began studying reincarnation and was convinced that her problems with depression stemmed from past life experiences. And I supported her in telling the story of her lifelong battle with depression, contracted for counseling services, and then requested a release to talk to her previous counselor. And that was a local counselor that I knew well. So contacting her previous counselor proved to be a really interesting experience because she spoke of Gail's preoccupation with past lives and that Gail would spend a great deal of time ruminating in session about what her past lives must have been like to generate so much depression. And she resisted referrals for medication evaluation because she said, if I can just find the source of this depression, I believe that God and I can heal it. And so the client terminated after the counselor got frustrated with Gail and told her that she shouldn't worry so much about past lives until this one wasn't so messed up, which was a response that the previous counselor admitted was unhelpful. And based on the initial session, I kind of conceptualized Gail was kind of struggling with the spiritual bypass. And she was, I believed a little bit hyper focused on karma as the cause of her depression. And while I was not in a position to say if this is true or not, I kind of expected that her counseling process would be more complex than this. So in the next session, I further assessed what Gail thought the results might be of doing some past life work. And her answer seemed to make it clear that she was not looking to lessen her depression, but was rather looking for a reason or maybe an excuse for why she was depressed. So I was prepared to refer Gail to somebody who did past life hypnotherapy, as that's not part of my counseling work. But on my conceptualization, though, I was hopeful that I might be able to work with Gail in such a way that the problem was not seen as solely spiritual or karmic, and while still respecting her belief system. And so my treatment approach was to remind Gail that she had been depressed for, as she reported it, as long as she could remember, and that it was probably important to get better slowly. And I told her that, I thought it was important to go back in time, but we shouldn't start out by going straight back to our past lives. And maybe we should work to understand the early part of this life as a stepping stone back to the past lives. And although I think Gail was hoping to immediately do past life work, she agreed that this made sense, and we moved forward with our work together. So using this integrated combination of like early life recollections from like an Adlerian framework and some experiential approaches to work with those early recollections in the here and now, Gail started to unearth and heal some early trauma, including sexual and physical abuse. And she started to connect with her anger and learn to channel that energy in appropriate ways. And she started to be a little bit more assertive. And as she reported at the end of the 9th session, I feel like I finally found my voice. And I experienced Gail as a deeply spiritual woman, and we both spoke of feeling supported in our work together by something beyond us. And as her counseling progressed, she talked less about past lives. And during our termination session, Gail laughed and said, "I still feel a little down sometimes, but nothing like I did. Maybe I'll do some past life work sometime later just for fun, but that doesn't seem nearly as important as it once did." And Gail did some amazing work as she started to heal some very old psychological wounds. And if I did anything well with Gail, it was honoring her belief systems while still working in a way that seemed psychologically grounded and sound. By using her framework of past life work to get her to work with her early childhood experiences. So in her case, the work was largely at the cognitive and emotional levels, which resulted in some clear changes in interpersonal behaviors. So to have supported her in her desire to work only on the spiritual level would have kind of been a therapeutic blunder, because it would have supported her proclivity toward that spiritual bypass. Looking at acervic competencies, this is the Association of Spiritual, Ethical, and Religious Values in Counseling. They've developed some competencies for integrating spirituality into the counseling process. And so counselors can increase their level of awareness and knowledge and skills with respect to their own as well as their client's spirituality by reflecting on each one of these competences. So there's 9 of them. The professional counselor can explain the difference between religion and spirituality, including similarities and differences. The professional counselor can describe religious and spiritual beliefs and practices in a cultural context. They can engage in self-exploration of religious and spiritual beliefs in order to increase sensitivity, understanding, and acceptance of diverse belief systems. They can describe their religious and or spiritual belief system and explain various models of religious or spiritual development across the lifespan. They can demonstrate sensitivity and acceptance of a variety of religious and or spiritual expressions in client communication. They can identify limits of their understanding of a client's religious or spiritual expression and demonstrate appropriate referral skills and generate possible referral sources. They can assess the relevance of the religious or spiritual domains in the client's therapeutic issues, and they're sensitive to and receptive of the religious and or spiritual themes in the counseling process as it befits the express preference of each client. And the counselor is using a client's religious and or spiritual beliefs in the pursuit of the client's therapeutic goals as benefits the client's express preference. So what I would like for you to do is I want you to select at least 3 out of those 9 competencies, and I want you to brainstorm some ways that, be specific here, some specific ways that you can increase your awareness, knowledge, and skills for each selected competence. Just pick 3 of them and put how you can increase your awareness, knowledge, or skills for those. So in summary, if one believes, consistent with the majority of the U.S. citizens, that spirit exists in some form and that one's religion or spirituality are aspects and expressions of culture, then counselors should be trained to address client issues related to religion and spirituality. So this lesson is really considered aspects of both the diversity of religious and the spiritual beliefs and practices, as well as the unity that can be seen woven through the tapestry of the world religions. Spirituality is difficult to define, and it's been described as a set of individual belief practices and experiences that lead to transcendence of self and a connection with others. Religion can be looked at as an organized spirituality. So the relationship between spirituality and religion can be conceptualized in a lot of different ways, either complementary or coincidental, but religious practice, not necessarily indicative of quality of religious or spiritual experience. Or spirituality is disconnected to an organized religion. So there's several major religions that were described in this lesson: Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. And while these religions are distinct from each other, there are several common tenets across those religions. And we also discussed several approaches that we can take in integrating spirituality into counseling. And those include rejectionists, where the counselor is dismissing or avoiding discussions of spirituality; exclusivists, where the counselor is respecting the client's spiritual and religious beliefs to a degree that they match the counselor's beliefs; constructivists, where the counselor attends to how the spiritual or religious belief is constructed; pluralist is the counselor respects multiple beliefs and they're willing to share his beliefs with the client; and then impositional, where the counselor is imposing a spiritual or religious framework on the client who is either atheist or non-religious. An issue that may arise when working with clients is going to involve the spiritual bypass, in which clients are attempting to solve psychological issues with their spirituality alone. And then lastly, it's going to be important to be ethically and culturally competent when integrating spirituality into counseling. The acervic competencies are a useful framework to start to think about the ethical and cultural competence. So within the ancient Sanskrit language, there's a word that lacks a one-word translation in English. It kind of characterizes one way in which spirituality can be integrated within the counseling process, and that of seeing the client as more than a cluster of symptoms to be reduced. And it kind of translates as the light within me bows to the light within you. So what I'd like for you to do is to practice a meditation. And the purpose of this closing meditation is to allow people with diverse beliefs about spirituality to work with their spiritual connection. So read the instructions here, find a quiet place to sit where you won't be interrupted. During this meditation, find some soft ambient background music you can use to support the meditation. Begin the meditation within a few minutes of deep and slow, shallow breathing. Deep, full, and slow breathing, in which you're intentionally breathing fully both into your abdomen and then into your chest. And then exhale. That should be used to release any remaining tension from the body. And then after several minutes of full breathing, consider a problem or challenge that you're currently facing right now, and bring that to your awareness. And this should be done without thinking about the problem, but rather just allowing it to emerge naturally. And then after considering this problem, we want to see a connection to spirit emerging before you. And this can take the form of a person, a deity, an animal, or some other form. And look at your connection. Look at spirit closely. Study it. Ask your connection to spirit what they have to tell you about the problem that's before you. And then allow the answer to emerge slowly and fully without thinking or judging the experience. And then after allowing this experience to play itself out fully for you, thank the connection to spirit for providing you with this wisdom, and allow the image before you to fade. And then journal on your experience, if you're doing this by yourself, or have a discussion about the experience from the meditation with others around you, like what it means for you in the coming days.